Take it away, Chayla.
Thanks, Marilee, and welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's really heartening to see this level of interest in our presentation today. So, as Marilee said, I'm Chayla Scott-Weber. I'm a Senior Program Officer here at OCLC for the Research Library Partnership, where I focus on research and programming that supports work in archives, special, and distinctive collections. We have a number of folks here today who I'm not sure regularly attend our webinars and may not be very familiar with the RLP. So I want to take just a minute to share what we're all about. The Research Library Partnership is a program of OCLC and is a membership program. If you're here today in this live webinar, your library is a member and you are a partner. RLP is a unique international collective of peer institutions and colleagues. And together with my fellow program officers, we work hard to create opportunities and spaces for members of the partnership to work together to address common issues facing research libraries through programming like this webinar today, discussion groups, working groups, and other research efforts. OCLC has a long history of work in the area of archives, special, and distinctive collections in research libraries. We work in special collections because we recognize them to be an important site of knowledge creation made possible by the library's commitment to the stewardship of these distinctive collections. We also understand the challenges brought about by the unique nature of material in special collections, and we work to identify areas of common need and complicated challenge and build programming that helps libraries scale up their learning and expertise with these collections. And so we're here today to contend with one of these truly complicated but vitally important challenges and share learning across the partnership. Diversity, equity, and inclusion have been an important area of focus for research libraries for a number of years now. But there's been an increased sense of urgency in recent months for many to confront an attempt to dismantle systemic racism, confronted by the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others this year, and inspired by the organizing of the Black Lives Matter movement. Many research libraries put out statements affirming the value of Black lives, condemning white supremacy, and committing themselves to confront racism and bring about systemic change in their own institutions. While important, statements such as these will be largely symbolic if we don't now do the challenging work to figure out what material support and concrete action is needed to work toward our anti-racist intentions and aspirations. Part of confronting systemic racism and other structural oppressions is recognizing that they're upheld in our institutions through policies, procedures, and everyday workflows. I think this can feel overwhelming, but I'd also like to frame it as an opportunity, that there is some part of practice that each of us has responsibility for and therefore can examine and change. And that's why I'm so grateful that SL and Jenny have agreed to share their work with us today. When I first read SL's article in the Code for Lib Journal about some of their earlier work, I was struck by these sentences that recognize the way that the history of racism at their institution was upheld via routine, everyday practices that required investigation and intervention. Their work is a great example of the kind of concrete action that we can all take in one area of work in our own institutions. Beyond our presentation today, we really hope to continue supporting this work in the RLP, including through sharing of other efforts happening in the partnership. We are interested in examples, big and small, of work to examine and make interventions in policy and practice at your institution in service of anti-racist, equity, and inclusion goals. And any facet of your program is of interest, from restructuring reading room policies to altering descriptive practice or auditing collections and altering collection development strategies to framing leadership approaches. If you have an idea for a webinar of your own, please do be in touch. And if you'd like to participate in future conversations and aren't already subscribed, please join our primary sources email list that highlights our programming around special collections, or our announced list that highlights the programming across all our areas. I'll put a link into chat, or you can just email me. I'll be more than happy to add you. And with that, I'll turn it over to SL and Jenny.
And let me take just a minute to flip around some slides here. Hold on just a second. And turn things over to Val. There you go.
Okay. Hello. I assume everyone can hear me.
Yep. Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. I cannot see any of you, but I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm so delighted that you are here wherever here is for you. I hope, Jenny and I have been talking about this, our goal today is to be sure that we are not the absolute worst webinar that you have experienced this pandemic. And I want to thank Marilee and Shayla and Mercy for all the work in making this happen. So we've been talking about doing this for over a year. In fact, I went back to check my emails to be sure that statement was true. And I mentioned this to thank you all again for your patience and perseverance, but also introduce a prominent theme in today's presentation, which is how much things change and how quickly things change. But before I say too much about that or anything else, I want to be sure that you had a firm picture in your mind about who's speaking since you cannot see us. This is us. I'm there on the left. There are maybe two things you might notice about this. First, yes, that's a faux pearl, faux necktie necklace. It's a family heirloom, and I love it. But number two, what I do want to point out is our whiteness. So this is a presentation that describes projects designed to counteract racism. And as such, beginning with a note about our whiteness is essential. So we are white. We benefit from the protections the whiteness affords and all the privileges. We regularly talk about racism and anti-racism without being accosted in person or online to the same extent as some of our other colleagues. And much of our thinking around these issues is indebted to BIPOC scholars and practitioners. Now that you have our slide cover today, we're going to start by talking about some work we did at LSU Libraries way back before the world ended. Specifically, I'll do a quick walkthrough of how we started to formulate our own criteria for digitization selection. We'll talk about the rather thin language that existed at the university level regarding diversity and inclusion initiatives at the time, and how we did our best to integrate these into our selection rubric. I'll then turn it over to Jenny to talk about the examination of past policies that inform current practices. As we'll see, a lot depends on criteria such as past use and intrinsic value when we're thinking about what to digitize. However, these categories are very much historically informed. After that, I'll turn to non-LSU examples. First, our current effort to take a lot of these same issues and apply them more broadly to Louisiana repositories through the Louisiana Digital Library. Then I'll talk about a handful of projects that I have nothing to do with, but that I think might be really helpful to know about for anyone doing work in this area. So, yes, we do it. Let's start talking about digitization prioritization. So, the broad scheme here is all of us in our institutions have an awful lot to digitize, an awful lot in our holdings, and where to get started and what to prioritize is the question. Starting back in the late 90s-ish, large universities started publishing digitization criteria policies. And these focus on making the case that digitization should be considered akin to collection development, such as purchasing or deaccessioning, and also making the case for moving from one-off projects to sustainable programs. So the two examples I have here is Harvard's internal white paper that became a clear monograph published in 1998, and Stuart Lee's report for Oxford, published on the web with all its glorious late 90s HTML. And these are just two early examples, of course. Many institutions have their own versions to varying degrees of completeness and adopted status. So just to get a sense of how these prioritization policies work, this is the ending graph of the Harvard report. It starts with questions such as, does the material have sufficient intrinsic value to ensure interest in a digital project? And then goes to the questions of copyright, technical capacities, conservation concerns. And if the answers to all these questions are affirmative in the right way, then it's safe to proceed with the project. Just one more quick example. This is Dartmouth's selection policy for digitization projects I was able to find on the website. The screenshot shows a checklist for reviewers. So based on a list of considerations, the reviewers can evaluate the desirability of a project. The considerations include, there is a definite set of anticipated users for these materials, and past use of these materials in their original format suggests that they will be used in the future. Right, so the point is to conclude whether or not digitization is worth the time and effort it requires. When we were spending time on this back in 2018, 2019, we could use a lot of these from other examples. But to these, we wanted to add diversity and inclusion considerations. So at the time, the strongest statements of need for diversity and inclusion came from the library's strategic plan. And so we used that to interweave this call into our selection process. So among other things, the strategic plan called for us to routinize adopting and augmenting of description of collections to expose otherwise hidden materials related to diverse and marginalized populations, and to increase diversity in the collections, especially emphasizing building historic collections that represent the whole of Louisiana history. So the strategic plan didn't name the history of structural racism that made these actions necessary, but we took it as a given that this is what we were trying to do is undo the racism that shaped our physical and thus digital collections. And as Shayla pointed out in the introduction just a moment ago, of course, during 2020, a lot has changed at LSU, also presumably at your own institutions as well. At the highest levels of the university, we now have working groups and committees investigating how to be anti-racist. And this certainly changes what it looks like to be doing this work now in our own little corner of the library. So as I said before, because of priority policies shared by because of all these shared examples from other institutions, much of the work moved fast, so there was much that we could immediately adopt, such as considerations of past use, conservation needs, copyright restrictions, technical capacities, etc. And to these, we added an additional criteria of trying to diversify our digital collections. Using the language of the strategic plan, we were augmenting descriptions to expose otherwise hidden materials related to diverse and marginalized populations. So that's where we were when the pandemic hit. We're still tweaking the details, but the broad approach is there. Decisions about which manuscript collections to digitize have already been affected to varying degrees by these considerations. And that leads us up to about where we were in the article that was published that Shayla drew attention to in the introduction. And I'll now pass the presentation to Jenny, who will offer a deep dive into the history of LSU Libraries, which is relevant for our consideration of determining what constitutes intrinsic value in past use.
Yes. In developing a digitization policy, I think it is necessary to understand that we are not doing this in a vacuum. Our institutions have a past, and it is important to critically examine past practice and the impact that bias may have had on the composition of our collections. It is not possible to simply port these policies into our own institutions because we must adapt them to local contexts. So what local context at LSU existed that may have needed to be taken into consideration? There are several aspects of the discussed approaches to digitization selection that gave me pause. Namely, the desire to mimic collection development practice based upon subjective judgment of intrinsic value, or more importantly for my purposes, that selection be made based upon past usage, because as stated in one of the policies, past use of these materials in their original formats suggests that they will be used in the future. But what if past usage was impeded or tightly controlled? In examining our local context at LSU, it became very clear that despite the mission statements to the contrary, access to the collections was by no means a given, and any usage of materials was governed by a complex web of policies which ensured that only those deemed worthy by the archive staff were allowed to enter. There can be no doubt that this historic gatekeeper mentality had an impact on past usage of our materials. The drive to democratize access to archives is a fairly recent phenomenon and has been unevenly adopted. By examining and becoming more aware of how access to our collections may have been impeded or controlled in the past, perhaps we could take the opportunity to utilize digitization as a means of course correction and bring previously hidden collections to light. Before I go into more depth about how access to collections worked in the past, I'll give a super brief background on the history of LSU Special Collections. LSU Libraries Special Collections came together as part of an arranged marriage in 1985 and consisted of a number of independently organized collections of rare books, Louisiana materials, and manuscripts. All of these disparate parts were combined under the principal mission to preserve these collections, add to them, and make them available for use. For our purposes, the focus will be specifically on the LSU Department of Archives and Manuscripts rather than Special Collections as a whole. Louisiana Room and Rare Books Room, the other elements of Special Collections, were more organically developed collections that grew out of a treasure room in the library and were largely shaped by the nature of the accumulated material rather than any sort of intent. The LSU Department of Archives and Manuscripts presents a very different story and was created at a very specific moment in time for a specific purpose. It came together at a seminal time for American archival history. The National Archives was founded in 1934. The Society of American Archivists held their first meeting in 1936. In the same year, the LSU Department of Archives and Manuscripts was formally created by the Louisiana State Legislature to serve as both a repository for the governmental records of Louisiana, but also as a depository for historical manuscripts documenting the history and culture of the state. The collection was to include state documents, the records of the flagship university, and the papers of the people and families that shaped Louisiana. A worthy goal, to be sure, but one that was rooted in the sensibilities of the day and rife with bias colored by the racist, sexist, and classist views of the leaders of the program. A bias which manifested in many forms and impacted what was collected, what was processed, and most importantly for our purposes, who was allowed to access materials. There are a multitude of caveats and systems in place that are meant to ensure that only the right sort of researchers were permitted to access materials. Even in cases where access was granted, there were clear indications that every effort was made to control how and by whom manuscript materials were utilized. Beginning in 1951, the head archivist, Virgil Betzel, began to work on construction of a code to inform how collections were accessed and used. Though the finalized version of this code was difficult to piece together, it is clear that Betzel and the other staff in the department looked to their colleagues in the profession for guidance on how to control their usage. He corresponded with colleagues at other institutions and also consulted a report by the Association of Research Libraries Committee on the Use of Manuscripts by visiting scholars. The report discouraged impeding access to manuscript materials for qualified users. Qualifications for researchers included trustworthiness, an intent to use the material for scholarly purposes, and the necessary training to effectively do so. The code governing the usage of manuscript collections centered around the desire among archive staff to exert and maintain control over the collections in their care. This is not simply to establish intellectual control, but also to ensure that those lucky few who were granted access to use them in the right way, to encourage their use in worthwhile research and to conform to propriety and good taste. Assistant archivist Marcel Schertz, who was primarily responsible for reference, complained endlessly about the undergraduate students, whom she referred to as strays, who wandered into the archives out of mere curiosity. What archive staff considered to be worthwhile did not include genealogical research or class projects for undergraduates, as the material in the collection did not lend themselves easily to such minor research use. In the annual report from 1958 to 1959, Betzel touted the success of a program using form letters to curtail inquiries related to genealogy and Confederate military service. The effort to control the flow of information about the collections required a lot of additional documentation of not just the collections, but also the researchers themselves. Researchers were required to fill out a researcher application form at the beginning of each visit, which provided details on their research interests and academic background. These forms were utilized by staff to record information about records interactions, including information of what staff member they spoke to and which resources they were allowed to access. In certain cases, some effort was made to verify the veracity of the information provided by patrons, including checking with programs on campus to confirm enrollment. No effort was made to maintain patron privacy, as researchers were regularly provided with names and information about researchers investigating similar topics. For some researchers, archive staff maintained extensive files, including newspaper clippings about publications and job changes, in addition to the records of their interaction with archive staff. Efforts to control and use eventually manifested in the creation of a series of access restriction codes, which could be applied to individual collections. I have thus far been unable to pinpoint exactly when the first access restrictions were put into place, as they were often imposed. They were not really ever imposed at the time of acquisition or accession. So the advent of this system remains unclear. There is some indication that the access restrictions were loosened somewhat in the decades prior, but a comprehensive review of these policies was conducted by Stone Miller beginning in early 1986 at the behest of Library Director Bob Martin. Miller did a complete assessment of all access restriction policies and reviewed the exception files for collections in order to get a clear picture of what restrictions were in place. At the time of review, there were 10 numeric restriction codes. Without more explicit documentation, it is difficult to determine how some of these numerical restrictions would have manifested in practice, but it was clear that in some collections, it signaled to the archivist on duty that these materials carried some special circumstances which governed how it should be used or not by patrons. The lack of centralized documentation caused problems even when the restrictions were still in place. In fact, the Registrar of Manuscripts limits in a memorandum. As I have said before, this whole business of restrictions has been hit or miss fair at best. Additionally, it is clear from other memoranda related to patron visits that there are always exceptions to every rule. The centralized listing of restricted collections was always incomplete, but restriction numbers were recorded in the two main access systems, the manuscripts card catalog and the inventory files. The card catalog consisted of cards carrying cross-references that referred to collection-level cards, which carried the collection title, restriction code, and a brief abstract. For more in-depth description of collections, patrons could consult paper inventories and calendars that included the same cross-references listed in the catalog. The restricted collections generally were housed in the pending or reserve file that was not browsable by patrons, and oftentimes patrons would pull the inventory folder to find it contained a single page stating, "This collection is restricted, folder is located in archivist's office." In certain instances, this would be where their journey ended. But a few lucky researchers would be granted partial or complete access to restricted materials, depending on the whims of the archive staff. As part of his review, Miller went through the manuscripts card catalog and created a listing of all collection cards which carried a code. By the end of the list, it included 460 collections with some type of restriction. By far the most prevalent of these numerical restrictions was the number 7 for genealogical materials, despite the fact that the archivists believed that there was little research value in manuscript materials for genealogical research. The existence of this type of restriction is somewhat surprising, but also given the fact that they actively discouraged use of the department's holdings for genealogical research, using their system of form letters and departmental referrals. Nevertheless, the number 7 was applied to numerous collections, but was only enforced on researchers who expressed an interest in family history. These access systems were also in a constant state of flux, depending on what researchers were visiting at any given time. In certain cases, temporary cards were added for collections prior to the visit of certain researchers. In other cases, word of mouth would be the only avenue for learning of a collection's existence, as seen here regarding a list of collections removed from the main catalog, where reference archivist Marshall Surtz writes, "These collections may be used by searchers who already know about them and for serious research." The idea was to remove them from the temptation for the genealogists. Beyond restriction type 7, the other more frequently used numbers were restrictions type 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The number 1 restriction was utilized to reserve certain resources for researchers interested in editing manuscript materials for publication. This reservation system appears to have been limited to the use by faculty, especially those in the history department. A graduate student who requested the same courtesy was denied, though reassurances were made that there was little chance that someone else would utilize the material prior to completion of the project. This privilege was extended to faculty, and in some cases, resources were preemptively restricted in order to offer certain history faculty right of first refusal. Such was the case for Joseph L. Brandt's account of Duncan Kenner's mission to France on behalf of the Confederacy that was purchased from a dealer in 1958. Rather than process the material for use by patrons, it was placed in the pending file for review by Virgil Betzel, so we could call it to attention of professors in the history department. The collection also carried a number 5 restriction due to its high purchase price, and its usage was tightly controlled. In 1959, a patron who was writing an account of Duncan Kenner's life was deemed too inexperienced to view the entirety of the counteract papers and was therefore only permitted to use box 3 from the collection. Later in 1966, a temporary card was created for an account book from the same collection prior to a specific patron's visit. The Type 3 restriction was meant to be applied to current or recent events as a precaution to protect the privacy of living persons. Though such a restriction may be considered valid by current professional standards, the way the restriction was applied diverges from those standards and is an indicator of their desire to control the usage of information. One of the more extreme examples can be found in the treatment of the Prevost family papers. The collection was acquired via purchase from a dealer in 1959 and was split into 2 parts, with a restriction of Type 3 for time-sensitive materials and a Type 5 for the value. The Type 3 restriction was applied due to the presence of correspondence related to a succession dispute involving the illegitimate mixed-race child of a prominent New Orleans family. This restriction was applied despite the fact that the dispute occurred over 100 years prior to the acquisition of the collection. And though the restriction should have been invalidated at the time of the review, the restricted materials was not reintegrated into the collection until 2002. Another similar example can be found when examining the handling of the Joseph P. Horner collection, which was acquired in multiple purchases over the course of 1963 to 1965. The collection consisted primarily of printed rather than manuscript materials, including multiple newspapers, publications, and pamphlets published by the Ku Klux Klan. All of these materials were deemed too sensitive to allow unfettered access and were placed under a number 3 restriction in 1968 and reserved only for those interested in conducting serious research. In other cases, the restriction was applied to materials detailing events that may not have been considered at all recent, including a number 3 restriction placed in 1964 on documents from a criminal case against J. Ernest Breda for stabbing John Cosgrove in 1872. Archive staff did not limit themselves to placing single types of restrictions. In addition to this Type 3, there was a Type 1 restriction on a group of letters from Louisiana Governor Henry Allen. There was a Type 4 on certain items due to their fragile condition. And a few statements by J. Ernest Breda made in 1894 were considered especially valuable and received a Type 5 restriction. The description of this material was kept separate in the pending inventory files, while the rest of the collection was open for research. These restrictions were not lifted until October of 1992. Though in many cases the restrictions were applied without any involvement of donors, there were instances where donors were permitted to exert quite a bit of control over the usage of their family's materials. With the assistance of archive staff, the donor of the David Weeks and family papers initially required that permission be sought before his family papers could be made available for use. But even after the donor requested that this restriction be lifted in 1954, the archivist kept it in place for the portion of the collection related to the Weeks family home, Shadows on the Teche, lest such an excellent subject as the history of the Shadows and its people be butchered by some hack. The Moses and St. John R. Liddell family papers were acquired via purchase from the family in 1939 and carried a number of restrictions, including a Type 1 restriction, which reserved a Civil War memoir for publication by a researcher. The rest of the collection was initially made accessible to researchers until the daughter of the original donor expressed dismay over the level of access researchers were granted to the collection, running in 1960, and besieged with requests for information on our family history. There are many persons related to us by blood to whom I would not make the family papers available. Widows who in my childhood were very scarce are now popping up out of the bushes. In response to the donor's concerns, restrictions were placed on materials relating to a Hatfield-McCoy-style feud that occurred between the Liddell and Jones families. A researcher who had been permitted to access the feud-related materials in the mid-1960s was dismayed to find that they were denied access during a subsequent visit some years later. The donor later expressed anger over the use of the material by non-family members, as well as publications which mischaracterized the events of the feud. Apparently, publications failed to document what a contemptible bunch of scalawags the Jones family surrounded themselves with, failed to take the Liddell perspective into account and mischaracterized their family's role in the feud, as though restricting access to the information about their family would not have had just such a result. Stowe Miller's review was completed in March of 1987, and only restrictions 3, 4, and 6 were retained as valid. And the Type 3 restriction was narrowed to protect the privacy of living individuals. So Miller immediately began moving some materials which carried other types of restrictions out of the locked cage area of the stacks and reuniting them with their collections. It seems the restriction numbers were not officially ruled invalid until 1994. The lack of standardized documentation of the restrictions for their complicated matters, and certain materials remain hidden behind invalid restrictions until as late as 2002. Even after their official removal, the restrictions placed on collection material has often prolonged their stay in the backlog. Despite the fact that they were acquired in 1939, the Liddell family papers remain partially unprocessed and have no electronically available finding aid. The Huey P. Long papers were acquired in 1956, but still only have a paper inventory that has yet to be made available. As LSU Libraries Special Collections work to establish new digitization prioritization standards, current practice within the field was taken into consideration. I also acknowledge that there are legitimate reasons for restrictions, but the majority of the restrictions imposed over the years have no justifiable basis, and their haphazard application has only served to impede a centrally stated purpose of the founding of the archive, to make materials available for use. Perhaps taking these circumstances into account when making selection for digitization will allow us to make amends for past mistakes and make these materials as widely available as possible. But just as we looked beyond LSU when initially crafting our policy, I turn things back over to SL to discuss some of the projects that have caught our attention more recently.
Fantastic, thank you. So as Ginny shows, we have deep institutional roots in structural racism, to say nothing of the sexism and classism. And to the extent that even the more straightforward sounding criteria for digitization prioritization, such as past use, is complicated. So in addition to everything else, we need to consider when we're building digitization policies, the restrictions of the collections. And these should also be taken into account, and local institutionally specific histories are important for this work. So that's an outline of our thinking about how to go about counteracting legacies of white supremacy at LSU Libraries, which is the little corner that we have some small control over, or did at some point. And at this point, I'd like to switch focus and talk about what's happening beyond LSU. As Ginny says, first up, I'm thrilled to say that a number of the concerns that motivated our work at LSU Libraries has been generalized to the entirety of the Louisiana Digital Library community via a Collections as Data grant. Very briefly, the Louisiana Digital Library is a statewide repository for digital cultural heritage material with over 30 participating institutions, including public libraries, academic libraries, archives, and museums. For many of the institutions in Louisiana, the LDL is the only means of showcasing their digital cultural heritage. And as such, each institution has complete control and final say about what they digitize and upload to the LDL. To date, however, there have been minimal conversations, if any, around the topics of selection for digitization or the level of cultural awareness for our descriptions of people and communities. That is, as a group, we haven't asked who and who should at each institution decide what gets digitized and uploaded, and who should have a say in how the material is represented and described. And this grant is our first opportunity to do this. So our first step was a survey that we distributed to all participating institutions so that we could capture a snapshot of current practices. The next step includes events to help us form shared vocabulary and action plans. One very exciting part of this is that we are gathering together virtually, of course, for everyone's safety, nationally recognized academics and practitioners in the field of librarianship, digital librarianship, and cultural heritage to help us explore ideas around selection for digitization, empathetic descriptions, and digital cultural heritage as data. So I hope you'll be able to join us for the LDL speaker series. I see that we have a link in the chat. I'm very happy about that. We have an amazing lineup of thoughtful, knowledgeable folks, and I really think it's going to be great. And now for some projects that I have absolutely nothing to do with. These are just some current examples that I've had a chance to talk to people about recently. Definitely not an exhaustive list. And additionally, this small sample leaves out many projects that have gotten, in my opinion, very much well-deserved attention recently, such as the anti-racist description resources from the Archives of Black Lives Matter in Philadelphia, which we'll have a link of in the recording. Instead, I'm just going to mention a handful of projects that I think represent a nice spectrum of the possible ways this work is being done by different institutions. I hope you find this as helpful as I do. Stephanie Becker at the Kelvin Smith Library at Case Western Reserve University has been working on a digitization selection rubric that I'm eager to share. The rubric they're using has many of the same categories we saw elsewhere, including past use, which is the frequency of reference requests for the material, and metadata restrictions, which take into account time and complexity of being able to describe the collection. But also includes diversity and inclusion criteria that evaluate the collection's ability to amplify nationally or globally marginalized voices by digitizing collections that represent historically underrepresented groups. So one of my favorite things about this project is that the workflow involves assigning a point person to each category. And that point person is responsible for providing scores for each collection as it relates to their assigned category. For example, the metadata librarian scores the metadata category. This process enables the inclusion of people outside the immediate library. For instance, the diversity working groups, have somebody from those groups be the point person for the diversity and accessibility sections of the rubric. So both, so here in this slide, but also in the recording links, we have links to a blank example rubric sheet, as well as a white paper written on the process, which for those of us still thinking about all of this are both very, very helpful. And thank you again, Stephanie, for doing this work and for being willing to talk to us about it for this. So in June of this year, the Alabama Department of Archives and History released a statement of recommitment in which they acknowledged the institution's roots in structural racism and vowed to expand efforts to create inclusive stories of Alabama's past and present. And though the statement itself doesn't mention the role of digitization selection in expanding inclusive stories, Meredith McDonough and the digitization teams at the archives are focusing on collections that do just that. And notable collections include the case files of the Alabama Supreme Court that provide access to important content in the identity and legal standing of African Americans during slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Another project is the Civil War and Reconstruction Governor's Papers, which also gives further insight into the political and social structures in Alabama during those same decades, particularly information regarding the changing legal status of African Americans in the state. And their ongoing project, which I think is worth seeing, is the 1867 voter registration database, developed from voter registration ledgers used to register formerly enslaved Alabamans. One of my favorite things about this project is the scope and impact of the collections. By focusing on records that tell a deeper story of the history of Alabama, especially focusing on the records of enslaved and previously enslaved individuals, a deeper understanding of the entire state is possible, to say nothing of the role of structural racism in aspects of everyday life. The Center for Primary Research and Training at UCLA Libraries Special Collections pairs graduate students with special collections projects. In 2019, the project for the center was a redescription of Japanese American collections. Updating language to better align with contemporary usage and standards, the current project for the center attends to all finding aids in digital collections, with students acting as audit scholars. What I love about this project from UCLA is that the audit scholars will be creating examples and lists, but will not themselves be expected to fix these issues in the finding aids of the digital collections. That work is reserved for staff, lest anyone think that such important work can be outsourced to students or be contained within a specific project. The links that we'll share here include an SAA newsletter about the Japanese American collections, as well as a link to a great zine that a student made, and the description audit scholars for the current project, set to begin soon. The Hagely Library in Wilmington, Delaware is a special collection library that focuses on the records of business and trade organizations. Lori Sather and her team are currently re-examining all finding aids to implement new subject headings to promote the discovery of marginalized communities within the library's holdings. These new descriptions will filter to digital collections and will aid in future digitization selection. This project takes advantage of two factors which many of us may be familiar with. One is that the library is currently switching content management systems for archival collections. They're moving from Content DM to archive space. And as those of us who have done this know, this is a fine time to rethink everything you've done as a human. And two, they're taking advantage of the disruption brought on by COVID. So with several months at home, metadata remediation could proceed at a rate much faster than usual. I'm excited to be able to include this example. I love that we have an example here of a special independent research library. And I thank Lori again for taking the time to talk to us about this. Lastly, I want to point out work currently ongoing at the Sunshine State Digital Network with member institutions all over the state of Florida. The network is also taking advantage of increased attention to metadata remediation, as so many of us are working from home. In just a few days, they're launching the Introduction to Conscious Editing series with Dorothy Berry set to speak on October 7th, I believe it is. This is a three-part series to introduce the practice of conscious and reparative metadata editing and geared towards information and cultural heritage professionals. Registration is open to those of us outside of Florida, I'm happy to say, and I'm excited to see the effects this has on the digital collections in months and years to come. A link to that series is now in the chat. So these examples I just shared, as well as the examination Jenny offered of the history of LSU Libraries' exclusionary practice, highlights the importance of the routine. The cultural heritage community is in the position we're in due to everyday routine practices of exclusion. So once the policies are set, once practices are established, the effect grows with years. The hope is that new standards, policies, and practices, once established, will become just as routine and will have just as large impact in the years to come. However, I certainly don't want to be too blasé about any of this. The backlash to anti-racist action is already full-blown. Earlier this month, the executive order was announced, which restricts at the federal level racial sensitivity and anti-racist training. This is likely to affect all of our work in some way or another in the future. Now, I mentioned before the changes at LSU, and as Shayla pointed out in the introduction, changes in the language at many institutions related to anti-racist policies and strategies. And I know those of us at the state level are paying very close attention to the current administration's reactionary policies. And while we don't know, because we couldn't have predicted where we are today, there's no way we can predict what the future holds. We do know what small corner of the world we have some control over, and we know what changes we want to see. So I'll end now with this quote from RBG discussing how she'd like to be remembered. I'll leave it on the slide for just a moment for anyone who wants to read it. And I'll say that I hope we all find the strength to make things a little better wherever we can. Thank you. I'm now done with everything I had to say. And I'm happy to say I would love to hear from everybody else. The more discussion, the better. These were just some examples that I know about and have recently talked to people about, but I'm sure many of you are doing great things.
Thank you so much, SL and Jenny. That was a terrific presentation. So we're going to move into the Q&A portion of events. If you have questions for SL or for Jenny, please put them into the chat. I'll go ahead and read questions from chat to make sure that they're on our recording and that everybody can knows what we're talking about. So the first question is from Emily Gore, and she says, thank you for these great presentations and your work on this important topic. She has two questions. I'll ask the first one first. How has this shift in policies affected your collection development policies in special collections? Are you seeking to purchase or acquire collections that align with your articulated values?
Ginny, I don't know if you want to try this.
I would say that our collections development policy hasn't been updated in the last decade or so, but has definitely moved beyond the sort of racist practice of the past, and has definitely become more inclusive in terms of collecting materials related to underrepresented groups and so forth. I mean, obviously, I have no say in this going forward, but it is definitely part of our collections development policy to continue collecting materials from more diverse populations than they would have done many decades ago.
And I'll just jump in to speculate. I think there are several other people here from LSU, so y'all can definitely jump in the chat as well. But I don't have anything to do with the directly with the acquisition of collections. But I would imagine because of all the attention being paid at the university level, that must filter down in some way, I would imagine.
Great, thanks. And the second part of the question is, are you working with other institutions who may have valuable collections in this area but may lack the capacity to digitize or host this material?
So I'll take this. Yes, we are. Mainly through the Louisiana Digital Library, which is again the statewide repository for digital cultural heritage materials for any institution in the state of Louisiana that wants to be involved. LSU is the technical home for the library, and one of the initiatives that we have is a mobile digitization lab, and we do try to identify institutions that don't have their own capacity. The project is new, but funding is guaranteed. So we're very happy about that. And we just pack up staff members and our equipment, and we drive all the back roads to these institutions, and we digitize the content and put it up in the LDO. And we're very excited about that. We've got some great things already, and we hope that grows. And what I particularly like is, we don't take any of their stuff. So we leave them with copies of the digital files that they can use for their own communities. And we take and do all the work of uploading the content for them.
Great, thank you. So I have a question that I'm going to go ahead and ask. It sounds like you had, good support at the leadership level, the strategic plan level of your organization, but I'm wondering about kind of how you socialize these changes in your institution and how they were received.
SL can jump in with an answer to that. But yeah, I say we have pretty good support at the institutional, sort of administrative level for pursuit of these sorts of projects. So yeah, so at the initial sort of beginning of this project, our diversity and inclusion efforts were fairly thin and sort of consisted of, slapping a statement up, and which was pretty standard for a lot of other institutions. And more recently, they have definitely done more to expand the diversity of our staff and create more concrete steps to sort of move in this direction. So yeah, we had great support from the administration. If SL has anything to add.
Yeah, I do. The second part of your question was about socializing it, I believe. And that part, I don't know that I did a particularly good job on that for a number of reasons. And I talk to people about this a lot. So when I started LSU Libraries, there wasn't a digitization policy to speak of. So the whole story is we started to think about the need for that, and we started to put one together, and that's the whole story that y'all heard for this presentation. But having a digitization policy doesn't mean that anybody has more time in their work schedule. So the idea was to include more people and evaluating which collections would be great, in a way similar to what we saw with the project at Case Western with Stephanie Becker, where different people get to rank different things. The problem is it's just difficult. That means that you've got to communicate this idea very well and make sure that people actually have the time to do this and a way to know enough about the collections to be able to rank them. Bringing in people from outside the immediate library. If for instance, you have a finding aid that's not particularly well, that doesn't particularly well describe a collection for all the reasons that Jenny mentions, then it's very hard to be able to ask somebody to help you evaluate that collection. So these are the types of things that sort of slowed us down in implementing and feeling like our draft is complete enough to ask for it to be adopted officially. I'll say, like, I've gotten better at articulating what the issues are, and in hindsight, I'm not at all surprised. And again, this just has to do with how long it took us to get in this situation and how long it would take us to get out of it. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we all know that writing a policy is one thing, and then getting people to use it is another. and even if everyone is bought in and engaged in using the policy, figuring out what that means on the ground is it can be a challenge. So I was so I was curious about that. Thanks for your candid answer. Folks, go ahead and put other questions in the chat. We have a comment here from Connor Casey at UW at the Labor Archives at University of Washington. It says that they have a upcoming book chapter that relates to what he's calling corrective collecting, but it also includes digitization, appraisal, and selection practice, and that Connor, is happy to share the chapter if anyone's interested, and Connor's put his email address in the chat.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Connor. I'll reach
out. Another question that's also sort of about the socialization, and that Jenny, you did a lot of work and you talked about a lot of past practice that frankly is probably embarrassing for folks, right? Or is hard to sort of acknowledge, and it's tough stuff. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like and how you approached that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been a bit of a history of archives nerd anyways, and I think the history of the Department of Archives and manuscripts at LSU is really fascinating. But also, I think, the sort of time to hide this stuff and pretend like it never happened is over. And so I think it's important to sort of take these things into consideration and understand that, you can't just start from, in our case, 2018 and move forward with policy if you don't reconcile sort of past practice. And so, and as I was digging into all of this, I just came up with so many. I mean, I only shared a few examples, but like I said, there were 460 restricted collections, and there were so many things that served as such an impediment to the efforts that we're trying to do now. I mean, as Scott said, we don't suddenly have a lot of time for this. And in a lot of cases, because these collections were restricted for so long, their existing description is a mess. And it was it's a mess by design. They had a very real fear of allowing unfettered access to the collections. They had super severe photo duplication restrictions. Marshall Schertz, who's the reference archivist that I mentioned, spent a lot of time that she should not have wasted on ferreting out what she referred to as unfair use of the collections. Tracking down faculty who loaned microfilm of the collections to their graduate students, and she would do whatever she could to stamp out such an unfair practice. But also, I mean, with their I didn't get a chance to talk about their collections development, but they were super. There was one specific example that I found across in the 1940s where they were offered a collection from an African-American collector. They had recommendations from other reputable dealers that the collection was super high quality, but the archivist recommended against acquiring the collection because he said that the value of the material was reduced because it presented Black history from the Black perspective. And so examples like that, I mean, yes, it's embarrassing for us as an institution, but at the same time, it's more embarrassing if other people find out about it. I think it's better for us to acknowledge it and talk about it and sort of name it, and also demonstrate efforts to course correct and do better.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's a solid place to wrap it up. Marilee?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, and I just want to thank you both so much for sharing so much knowledge and honesty with us all. It's, I think, a great example for us all to be curious, introspective, and honest. And I know that you guys all have so many other places to be, other meetings to join, et cetera. So happy to wrap things up a few minutes early. Again, this webinar has been recorded. We will be sharing the recording, the many links that are in the presentation, resources that were shared in chat, and get that all back out to you as quickly as possible, and then you can share it broadly. So I want to, once again, thank SL, Jenny, Shayla, everybody who is involved in the discussion, and this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
thanks,
thank
everyone.
You so much.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.